Hello, everyone. My name is Aneta Tyszko, and today our guest is Dr. Riffat Hassan, who is a Muslim Islamic feminist, and today she will be talking to us about feminist theology in Islam. Dr. Hassan, please start.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you. And I will start my conversation with you by providing you a little bit of context for my work. You know, how I got into this field of study. So I was born in Pakistan, and as you know, Pakistan is a Muslim country, and it is the only country in the world that was created in the name of Islam. It was carved out of United India, and it became an independent country in 1947. My immediate family came originally, I belong to the caste which is called the Sayyids, who are descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So they started from Arabia, and then my ancestors started from Arabia, and then they stopped for a long time in a place called Herat, which is in Afghanistan. And then they came to the city of Lahore, which is in Pakistan. And they set up a colony that all these, the extended family, which is called Muslim Town. So that was my home. I come from a family of 9 children. My parents had 9 children. They had 4 daughters and 5 sons. And I was exactly in the middle. I was the 5th child. To give you some idea of my parents, my father was a civil servant, worked for the government, and he had the reputation for being a very good, very saintly, very kind person who was very widely respected. My mother came from a very different kind of a background. Her ancestors were all connected with the arts. Her father was a very famous playwright and poet and scholar and so on from that side. So when my parents got married, my mother was 16 and my father was 32. It was a very big age difference. And not only was there a big age difference between them, but they were extremely, totally different in temperament. And I don't think that I have ever seen them agree on anything. So, but you know, in those days, if you got married, you stayed married, and they had a lot of children, and they were both very good parents. Amongst the various issues which arose in the family, which could be said that they created a sense of conflict, was on the question of how to raise the daughters. There were 4 of us, and I was the 3rd one. And my father was, you know, he was conservative, and the culture, of course, of that whole area is extremely patriarchal. You know what patriarchal is, you know, male-centered, male-oriented, male-controlled. So anyhow, my father was a very kind person, but, you know, he had a conservative way of looking at life. And he believed that girls should be married at around 16 to whoever was chosen for them by the parents. And he thought that was very good because that would give the girl the chance to get settled and have a happy marriage. And my mother had a very different idea about it. You know, she wanted that her girls should be educated. My mother was a very strange person in the sense that she was an ultra-radical feminist in those days. It was very, very rare. Anyhow, in the case of my 2 older sisters, this is what happened, that when my elder, and a marriage was arranged for her with a cousin. We have a lot of cousin marriages, and she was married at age 16. I don't remember her marriage very well because she was 10 years older than me. So I was only 6 years old when she got married. But when my second sister got married, she's 4 years older than me. I was 12. And I saw how the whole matter was arranged. My sister was not very keen to get married, but there was just a lot of pressure from the culture pressure, the family pressure. And so she agreed to the marriage. And so she got married at the age of 16 also. Now, as a child, when I was growing up, I was aware of the fact that there was a lot of conflict in my house. And I found my way of dealing with it was that I created a world of my own. You know, I always had an independent room, and I spent a lot of time in my room. I went to school. My school was a co-educational school with boys and girls. And I started writing poetry when I was very young. But anyhow, I fortunately for me was a very good student. So I was happy at school and so on. So I made my own world. I was very, very quiet in terms of my interaction with my family members. But, you know, when my sister got married when I was 12, it seemed to suddenly wake me up. And I said, well, I'm next in line. You know, 4 years from now, same thing is going to happen to me. So what am I going to do about it? You know, I was only 12. So I decided that I have to rebel. This might sound a little funny to you, but, you know, I decided at that point that I am not going to accept these rules and I'm going to rebel. Okay. So at the age of 12, I started my rebellion. The first conflict that arose between me and my father was on the issue of my school, because it was a co-educational school. I had 3 younger brothers. We all went to the same school, my 3 brothers and myself. But when I became 11 or 12, my father was not happy that I was studying in a school with boys. So he wanted to put me in another school. He wanted to put me in a convent taught by Catholic nuns. And I said, no, you know, I said, I'm not going to go. If you would take me out of the school, I'm not going to study. It's interesting because in that culture, you know, communication is done in a very indirect way. So it was not I was having this conversation with my father directly, but, you know, I knew through his conversation with my mother, which was within my hearing, that that's what he wanted. And I gave my answers the same way. You know, indirect conversation, I said no. So somehow, you know, he didn't take me out of the school, but he was very unhappy about it. And, you know, I used to play a lot of sports at that point. So the sports were always after school. So after school, I stayed a couple of hours to play games. And that was, my father was not happy about that. And, you know, when I went home, he was looking at the clock. He was wanting to know, why am I so late and so on. So that was the kind of situation that arose. And it was, you know, when you use the word rebellion in the Western context, you sort of have the image of somebody who's very wild, you know. And when I say I was a rebel, I wasn't wild. I just had my own priorities in life. I liked that school. I was good at studies. I was good at sports. I wanted to live my life. But in that culture, that was very, very difficult because I was going against the norms of the culture and of my own family. So what happened is that from about the age of 12 to about the age of 17, there was almost no communication between my father and me. He just stopped talking to me. And I felt that was, in a way, I was quite relieved because I didn't want to have confrontation. But, you know, it was a very strange time in my life that I had no communication with my father. But I knew that he was not happy with my being in that school and all that. I think the fact that I was a very good student helped me a lot because, you know, everybody likes to have their kids doing well in school. Anyway, so when I was 17, my eldest sister at that point had gotten a scholarship. She was married at 16, but her husband went to study abroad. So she was still living with my parents and studying, and she got a scholarship to go to England. So I asked her, I begged her, I said, please get me out of here. I want to go out abroad to study. So she managed to get me admission at the University of Durham, which is in the north of England. So at the age of 17, I left Pakistan. And my father spoke to me on the day I left, just, you know, gave me his blessing, but nothing more than that. So anyhow, so I went to England, and it was a great relief for me that I didn't want to live in a house of conflict. But at the same time, you know, I was very homesick, and going to a different country, it was, you know, a very big change for me. In the holidays, I used to go back, but anyhow, so in a sense, you know, it's sometimes when I talk about my life, I said, in a way, I kind of ran away from home at the age of 17 because I didn't want to deal with all the things there. But then, anyway, so I studied there. I stayed there as long as I could. I got my first degree in English literature and philosophy. And then I started studying a philosopher by the name of Iqbal, Muhammad Iqbal, and who had a very strong influence on my life, on my thinking. And then, so I wrote my PhD thesis on the philosophy of Iqbal. And then I was done, and I went back, and I was at that time 24 years old. So the situation in my relationship obviously had changed with both my mother and father, because I wasn't 12 years old anymore. You know, I was educated, I was more self-sufficient. And so, you know, it was different. But anyhow, then, so I had not agreed to being in an arranged marriage. When I was 25, I got married, and it was my own choice. And I'm a person who believes in making one's own mistakes. So it was a mistake, but and then I wanted to teach at the university. That was my first preference. I wanted to teach in the Department of Philosophy. And I applied, and I waited for a year and a half, and finally I didn't get the job. And the reason I didn't get the job was they said, she's too young and she's too qualified, because all the other people were men, and they were all much older, and none of them had a PhD, so they didn't hire me. And I ended up working for the government of Pakistan, the Department of Information. That was a very critical time in the history of Pakistan. And I want to say before I go forward that, you know, I come from the first generation of Pakistanis, and I had very deep love for my country. And it was my dream that I will, once I finish my education, I will go back and I will serve my country. So anyhow, so I got this job, and it was not my job, profession of choice, but anyhow, it was a good job. But then Pakistan was going through a very critical time, because the country there was a civil war going on in Pakistan, which ended up in the division of the country into two countries. Bangladesh was separated from Pakistan. So Pakistan kind of split up into two. It was a very traumatic experience. And more traumatic because I was in the department in Ministry of Information, and I saw what happened from very close quarters. And I saw that this split in the country was avoidable, but there were politicians who wanted it this way, so they acted in a way. They started a civil war, and the country was separated. That was a very big shock to me. And I also had found out by that time that my desire to serve my people, my country, was not going to be fulfilled because the attitude towards women that existed was very negative. I mean, I wanted an academic job. I didn't get that. This other job I got, but there still was not any respect for women. The first day that I joined that job, the senior officer called me. I introduced myself, and he looked at me and he said, "Why are you here? Can't your husband support you?" I mean, that was the attitude. Why are you here? Women should not be in jobs and outside and so on. Anyhow, so in 1972, I thought that I need to get out of here because the political situation was very bad. The patriarchal culture was everywhere. And so I said, I need to get out. So then in 1972, I came to the United States. And I came initially just to have a look. My sister was there. One of my sisters was living there. And I had some other relatives. So I came here looking for a job looking actually just exploring. And I got a job, temporary job, teaching at the University of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and so on. But like a lot of people who come to the United States, they come for a short time and they stay. And so I stayed as well because, there were some opportunities that I got. Okay. So this is now, so in 1972, I was in an area called Rosemont. It was outside of Philadelphia. And I knew by that time that my marriage was going to end, that it was not going to work out. And I accepted that. But anyhow, in 1973, my daughter was born. I have one daughter. She was born. And another very tragic thing happened in my life at that point, beside the marriage was going to break up. But in 1974, I lost two of my brothers within 2 months. My younger brother died of cancer and my older brother died of a heart attack. And that was a extremely traumatic event in my life. So in 1974, after my daughter was born, she was just a few months old and my brothers died. I decided that I have to now live on my own. And it was interesting because although I was very qualified, I had a PhD and academically very, 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 sound credentials, but I was very lacking in life skills in the sense that I didn't know how to drive. America was a different kind of a country. And I had lived for 7-8 years in England, but England was very different. I was living in the university and I didn't have to drive and so on. But anyway, so in 1974, I got a job in Oklahoma and in a place called Stillwater. Stillwater is a very small place, tiny place. And I got a job for a year and then I stayed for 2 years. And that was sort of my first regular job. So I went there and this is where my story becomes relevant for our topic today. In that university, there was a chapter of an organization called Muslim Students Association. There's a Muslim Students Association which has branches in every college and university in North America and Canada, very, very big. And so there was a chapter of this organization in Stillwater at the university, Oklahoma State University. And the university had a rule that every student organization needs to have a faculty advisor. It was necessary. That year, I was the only Muslim on campus. So I became the faculty advisor to this group. This group consisted entirely of men who were mostly from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, that area, which is a very conservative area of the Islamic world. So they were obviously not happy with I was their faculty advisor. They didn't have a choice. So this group in the fall of every year, they used to have a seminar. This was their big event of the year. And they would invite people speakers from outside to come and speak and so on. And the job of the faculty advisor was that they would come and talk for a few minutes about the topic and welcome everybody and get the thing started. However, in my case, the students came to me and they said, we don't want you to say anything about the topic, whatever the topic was, I don't even remember, but we would like you to talk about the role of women, Muslim women in Islam. What are they supposed to do? And I knew exactly what they had in mind. They wanted to know, how does a Muslim woman be a good mother, be a good wife? What are their duties and so on? So I knew that there were, I can't tell you how many, hundreds of writings on this subject, books, brochures, articles, virtually all of them written by men. So certainly that was the case in 1974. Now the situation has changed considerably. So I knew there was so many writing on that subject. So I said to myself, I accepted that invitation, although I knew that they meant to insult me basically by asking me to speak on this subject, because to tell me that you're not qualified to speak on anything else, even though I taught them Islamic studies, but they still were giving me the direction as to what I would do. So I accepted it for two reasons. One is that I said, there's so many writing on the subject of what Muslim women are and what they should do, written by men. So it's time for a Muslim woman to look at the subject. And you would be surprised to know that at that point, I was not very interested in that subject. But I took that opportunity. Okay, I'll see what I can do. And so that was one reason. And the other reason was this group of Muslim men was so patriarchal and so conservative that they thought that hearing the voice of a woman who was not related to them was haram, not permissible. So they were very unhappy first that I was teaching them, and then I was their faculty advisor, not happy at all. Anyway, this was in the summer. The seminar was 3 or 4 months away. And I thought about it very seriously. I said, what am I going to talk about? I've accepted this invitation, so what shall I talk about? So I thought that I would look at the Quran and see what the Quran says about women. Now I had read the Quran many times. I used to use it as a textbook in my courses on Islam, but I had not read it with the special focus on women. So I studied the Quran from that point of view, looking at all the passages that were relating particularly to women. And in those 3 or 4 months that I did this study, I started to get extremely angry. And my anger was due to 2 reasons. First, I realized that there was a big gap between what the Quran says are the rights of women and what is actually happening to women in Muslim societies. They're very different. That was the first thing. The second thing is that I realized for the first time in my life that a lot of what had happened to me was because I was born a female in a Muslim society. It's interesting, strange perhaps, that I had never made that connection before. So there was a very strong personal element that was involved because I started to make connections between a lot of things that I hadn't done before. I started to understand my father's behavior, the culture in which I had been born, and so on. So anyway, that was sort of the turning point in my life, 74. So what I don't remember much about what happened in the seminar, but I became very passionately involved in this study. And, I divide my life, and I look at my career, I divide it into phases. So I'm now in phase 1, and this phase lasted for 10 years, from 1974 to about 1984. And during this 10-year period, I was basically studying the Quranic text. Okay, now in the correspondence that I've received from you all, there's a question of the hermeneutics. What was my method of studying the Quran? Now, as you know, I'm sure you know that Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God, and that it was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and so whatever is in the Quran has the highest authority. Now, the first issue that I encountered in my effort to understand the Quran, I mean, you know, I could read the Quranic text, but you know, the Quranic text, like other scriptures, is a complex text. It's not so easy to understand it. And the first problem that I encountered was that there weren't any hermeneutics, there weren't any principle of exegesis that were outside of patriarchy. All these rules of interpretation had been devised by men, and they had been, if you looked at the Quranic texts, I mean, translations or the commentaries, they were all very much patriarchal in nature. And that didn't work for me. So I said, well, how should I do it? What should I do? I didn't have any kind of a model in front of me. And, you know, this is 1974, and I was the first Muslim woman to do this. Nobody had done this before. Okay, so I started with, I developed 3 principles. The first principle was what I call linguistic accuracy. You know, words also have histories. Words change their meanings over time. So my first quest was to understand what the words of the Quran, especially the key terms, the key passages, what did they mean in 7th century Arabia, in the area of the Hijaz where the Prophet lived and where the Quran was revealed? What did this word mean then? Because what it meant then is not necessarily what it means now. So that was the first thing. I wanted to understand that. The second thing was the first principle was linguistic accuracy. The second principle was philosophical consistency. Let me explain that. Say, for instance, take the word Adam. Now, Adam is actually not an Arabic word, it's a Hebrew word. But Hebrew and Arabic are both Semitic languages, and they're like sister languages, and they borrow from one another. So this word had come into Arabic from the Hebrew, and it is found 25 times in the Quran. So in order to understand what this word means in the Quran, you have to look at all the 25 instances where it is used. And out of the 25 times, 21 times it is used in the sense of humanity. You know, Bani Adam, children of Adam. It's a generic word for humanity. And 4 times it is used in a specific context with regards to a prophet. Okay, and I think I have to say one more thing just for clarification, because I don't know about the level of expertise that your group has about the Quran, that the Quran is not structured like the Bible. You know, the Bible is chronological and historical. You know, it starts at a certain point. God created the world in 7 days and goes on, and one prophet and then another one, and then it's linear. You know, you can say it's the history of the prophets going this way, chronological and historical. The Quran is not like that. The Quran has a bit of history, it has philosophy, it has law, it has descriptions of nature, it has a lot of different kinds of things, but they are all mixed together. And so there isn't any, you can't study it in that way. So it has its own kind of structure and its own kind of logic. That was another thing. Anyway, getting back to the 3 principles. So the first one was linguistic accuracy. The second one was philosophical consistency. If this word is used so many times in the Quran, what does it mean in all those contexts? Not just one, but all of them. Okay. And the third one, which was, I call it the ethical criterion. In a way, this was the most important one for me in terms of what I did later on in my research and in my study. What this criterion is as follows. It's like, okay, in the Muslim Sufi tradition, and in general also, Muslims say that God, the Quran, in the Quran, there are 99 names of God. God has many attributes, and 99 of them are very important. And one of the most important attributes of God is that God is just. This is emphasized very greatly in the Quran. God is just. God can never be unjust. God can never do injustice. The justice of God is fundamental. So if that is the case, that God is just, and the Quran is the word of God, then it follows that the Quran must reflect the justice of God, right? What does that mean? What that means is that if there is an interpretation of any text or any word, which is contrary to justice, even at a human level, it seems that, this is not fair, this is not just, then it cannot be the right interpretation, because if God is just, God's word must reflect God's justice, so that every interpretation that you arrive at must be just. Again, given the complexity of language, the Arabic language, it's one of the problems that has arisen is that many Muslims, particularly modern Muslims, because modern Muslims do not have a very sound basis of education in classical Arabic or classical Quranic interpretation. So they tend to read the Quran literally, just without any further exploration of these words, very literally. And so I think that that's a very major problem, because the Quran is not meant to be read that way. And a lot of the Quran is what I would call allegorical. It's symbolic. And you have to understand the symbolism to know what it's saying. Okay. So back to this criterion of justice, because what I had discovered in my study of the Quran and the Quranic passages relating to women, that there was a lot of injustice in how they were understood. And I said, this can't be the will of God. See, the Quran, the Muslims say, they believe that the Quran is ultimate. Quran is final. And in a sense, it is, we believe it's the final revelation. But beyond the Quran and before the Quran is God. If God is the author of the Quran, then God comes before the Quran, and God is higher than the Quran. So we have to know what is the intention of the author to understand what the text is. So these were my three criteria that I worked with for the most part. So anyway, back to 1974. So I was engaged in this study, and I studied it, the Quran, in very many different ways. Like, I did a study thematically. What does the Quran say about motherhood? What does the Quran say about marriage, divorce, inheritance, political rights? So I did a study like that. And by the time I came to the end of the 10 years, I was convinced that the Quran was not only fair, not only equal in its approach to men and women, but was heavily weighted in favor of women. Let me explain that to you. In the Quran, there is a very strong strain, and you find that also in the biblical text, that God tells believers that they have to take care of people who are disadvantaged, take care of the widow, take care of the orphan, take care of the poor person, the old person, the infirm. So the people who are disadvantaged deserve particular care. And women certainly are a part of this group. Okay? But when you talk about equal rights, and I'll come into that, I'll talk to you about that, in different contexts, say marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc. There is this understanding in the Quran, there's this knowledge in the Quran that women need extra protection. Let me take you back for a minute to history. When Islam was born, and the Prophet started receiving his revelation when he was 40 years old. He was born in 570, and this is about the year 610 of the Common Era. Female infanticide was practiced in Arabia. Female infanticide was the killing of female children. And it had gone on for a long time. And not all girl children, but a lot of girl children were killed. Why? There were two reasons for that. One reason was economics, because Arabia was a desert country. It had no rivers, no forests, no water. Life was very hard, and the people were Bedouins. They were nomadic deserts, living in very difficult conditions. And it was very difficult for them to raise children. So if they had daughters, they couldn't survive, so they thought that it was better to kill them. So economics was one part, but there was another part which is important to understand, and that is that there was a concept, very strong concept, of shame and honor in that culture, in that nomadic culture. The word honor in Arabic is understood in two ways. One is it is understood in a sort of general way, like if you translate honor as nobility, that in general, that these when you say these people are honorable, that they are good people, noble people, etc. That's one sense in which the word is used. But there is another sense in which this word is used, and that is that it is the opposite of shame. Let me explain this to you. Imagine the nomadic society, that they are in the desert and they are fighting against nature, they're fighting against other tribes. And there was a very good chance that the women in your tribe, the girls in your tribe, could be kidnapped, and they could be raped, something would happen to them. Now, if that happened, that would bring about a lot of shame to the men. It's interesting, they never thought that women had any honor. All the honor belonged to the men. But if something happened to a woman, or if she herself behaved in a way that they thought was inappropriate, it would bring shame to them. So there are two words for honor in Arabic. One is sharf, which is the general concept, general understanding, nobility, goodness. And the other word is ird, and that is honor that belongs to men, but is dependent upon the behavior or conduct of the women. It's particularly in that context. And so there's a verse in the Quran which says that when an Arab hears the news that a daughter has been born to him, his face becomes dark, and he is very angry and very perturbed. And he thinks, shall I kill it? What shall I do? Because he is afraid that this girl child might bring dishonor to him. This was a very real danger in their mind, caused a lot of anxiety. So when Islam was born, that was the situation. You can understand, that's sort of the gives you an index to that culture and the place of women in that culture. Okay, and so when Islam was born, it was created, there were two sources of authority there. First of all, the Quran, and what the Quran had to say. And the second was the Prophet himself, Prophet's life. And he was a tremendous supporter of women in so many ways. And he knew that that women were being discriminated against, and he fought very hard. And there's not enough time to go into all of the things that he did. But so in my reading, the 10 years I spent, I realized that the Quran was not discriminating against women, but what was happening was that the culture which had developed was very patriarchal and very biased against women. In the culture of Pakistan, for instance, beside the patriarchy, beside the patriarchal culture, there was also feudalism. You know, feudalism is when their land is divided amongst the very rich people. They have all the money and all the power, and then there are very few poor people in that region. So feudalism also is very authoritarian structure, you know, and it's very heavily weighted in favor of men. And then there was also tribal culture, which was similar sort of to the tribal culture of Arabia, where, you know, again, women in a tribal culture are given a very, very inferior position. So these were all the various factors. So now in those 10 years, I did do some writing, and I did, you know, talk about it in various places. But my main motivation in doing that 10-year, during that 10-year phase, was to make sense of my own life. I had to make, that was I was doing it for personal reasons. And that was one. And the other one was that I felt very strongly as time was going on that Muslim women don't know about this. You know, I had not known about it until 1974, even though I had a PhD and everything. I did not know it until I got into this study. So the other passion that I developed was I have to educate Muslim women. I have to give them this knowledge. So that's where I was. So let's go now to 1984. In 1979, an event took place which had a tremendous influence on the Islamic world, and that was the Islamic Revolution of Iran. You know, Iran had been a very secular country, and then all of a sudden, with Ayatollah Khomeini coming, you know, you go to the other side, and women were, you know, they had to wear the hijab, and you know, they were thrown out of all the universities and so on. So there was this phenomenon started that was called Islamization, which is the imposition of Islamic law on women. So when I went to Pakistan in 1984, this Islamization process was already going on in Pakistan and other places. And in Pakistan, the ruler that time was General Muhammad Ziaul Haq. He was a military ruler, and he was very conservative. And so he had promulgated these laws. The first set of laws was called the Hudud Ordinance, and then it was followed by some other laws, which were very discriminatory against women. For instance, one part of the Hudud Ordinance was called Zina Ordinance. Zina in Arabic means sex outside of marriage. Okay? And this Zina Ordinance stipulated that if anybody committed zina, it could be male or female, they had to be punished. You know, they had to be given, they had to be flogged in public 100 times, and if it was between a married person and another person, they could be stoned to death. This is in the Hudud Ordinance. This is not in the Quran. This is the law that was implemented. And the very first case that came up was that of a young girl who was about 16 years old. She was a domestic servant. She was near blind, almost blind. And she was raped by the master of the house and by his son, and she became pregnant. And her guardian took the case to the federal Shariat court, that's a religious court. And the court said, well, her testimony is not admissible because she's female. According to the Zina ordinance, women's Hadud ordinance, women's testimony is not acceptable. So said, if she says she's raped, no, we can't accept that. Secondly, she's blind. Okay, she doesn't know she can't indict anybody. And then she's pregnant, which means that she had sex. And so they said that because of the extenuating circumstances, she was poor and blind and so on, they weren't going to punish her to death by stoning, but she had to be put in jail and she had to be flogged. And so at this point, it became apparent to the women in Pakistan that these laws were going to affect every woman, not just, a few women. And a small group of women formed a group that was called the Women's Action Forum. Pakistan was under military law, martial law. No political activity was allowed. So this group of women, and this group of women were all very westernized women, secular women, coming from the higher strata of society, knew almost nothing about Islam, but they could see that these laws were going to have a big impact. And so in 1980, I was in Pakistan for 2 years, between 1983 and 1985. I had a year's sabbatical from my university, and I had a year's fellowship, a research fellowship. So I used to go to Pakistan almost every year, but at this point I was in Pakistan continuously for 2 years when all this was going on. And so in the summer of 1984, a group of women came to me and they said, these laws are coming. That was the first law, and then another law, and then another law. So what shall we do? We don't know enough about Islam to combat them. So you've been studying the subject for many years. Can you help us? So that was the second turning point. The first turning point in my life had come in Stillwater when I had realized the difference between the Quran and the culture. And this was the second one, because now it was not, I had been reading for myself, studying for myself, but now it was like, we need you to come up with a liberation theology for women. It was a very different kind of a challenge. So I told them I would think about that. Let me think about it. And I did a lot of study that summer. And aside from the Quran, I studied the books of Hadith, traditions, which are the second source of law in Islam. And then at the end, one thing I haven't mentioned to you earlier is that between 1974 and 84, while I was developing my understanding of these issues, I was also very much involved in interreligious dialogue with Jews and Christians. And I had been educated in a Christian school. So I had a pretty good idea about the situation of women in these religions. So in 1984, when I started thinking about what strategy I should develop, what should I do, I came to the conclusion that there are three fundamental theological assumptions, which are the ground on which the edifice of superiority of males is built. Now, these three assumptions are as follows. The first is that God's primary creation was Adam, that Adam was a male person, and that Eve was created from his rib, and she was therefore a secondary person, and she was subordinate and inferior. This is the myth of creation. Second is that though she was secondary in creation, she got Adam thrown out of paradise. This is the story which is called the story of the fall, that, eating of the forbidden fruit, and then they are expelled from paradise, and that it is the fault of the woman, and therefore she is not to be trusted. She's a seductress, and she's evil. This is the second one. And the third one was that not only was woman created from Adam, but woman was created for Adam. So he is fundamental and she's instrumental. Was created to serve him. So I identified these three questions and then I started working on them. And I spent a lot of time working on the first one, the story of creation. And I want to share that a little bit with you because I don't have the time to go into everything, but I'd like to talk to you about that. Now, in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, there are two creation stories. There's one in chapter 1 and one in chapter 2. And the one in chapter 1 talks about God created man and woman, and he created them equal and gave them dominion over the earth, etc. Which means in chapter 1, the creation story is that God created man and woman equal. In chapter 2, there's a different story. And the story is that God created Adam. First, God created everything in pairs. But God created Adam, he had no companion. So God put Adam to sleep, and whilst Adam slept, God took a rib from his side and made it into a woman. And so when Adam awoke, he saw the woman, he was overjoyed, and he said, bone of my bone, thou art, and we shall never be parted. So this is the rib story. And these stories are 500 years apart. The rib story was actually the earlier of the two stories, although it's second in the Bible. Anyway, now this idea of woman being created from a rib has been used in a million ways to make women inferior. It is the sort of the foundation of a lot of prejudice against women. Now, the interesting thing was that these in the Quran, there is no rib story. Okay? There are more than 100 Quranic references, more than 100, which say that God created man and woman equal, that they came from one source and that they're equal. So, and the word Adam that I was mentioning to you earlier, the word Adam, which is a Hebrew word, doesn't mean a male person. The word Adam, which is derived from the Hebrew word Adama, which means the earth, the word Adam means a human being. Okay? And the word human, which is a Latin word, also comes from the word humus, which means the soil. So the word Adam etymologically means a human being. So in the Quranic text, to make it short, in the Quranic text, there is no reference to any of this. But I've done a pop quiz all over the Islamic world, traveled very widely. And I've asked Muslim audiences, different kinds of groups, lawyers, journalists, students, other people in society. I asked them a simple question. I said, okay, tell me, how was woman created? These are all Muslim audiences. How was woman created? And they come back immediately from the rib of Adam. And I said, well, that's not in the Quran. The Quran doesn't say that. But they don't know that. But that's what they believe. And even going back and looking at the commentaries and so on. So, So I started then exploring this, that it's not in the Quran. So where is it coming from? Where is this idea that woman was created from the rib of Adam? And in my research, I came across these 6 hadiths, 6 traditions. They come from the hadith literature is very voluminous, and there are many collections. The 2 that are most authoritative are called, are the books compiled by Bukhari, and the second one by Muslim. These are the 2 most respected collections of hadith. And these 6 traditions that I'm talking about are from these 2 books, so they have a lot of authority. And what they are talking about is that woman was created from a crooked rib, okay? And you cannot straighten it out. And it will always, if you try to straighten it, it'll break. So, if I had the time, I would read all these to you. But anyhow, this is the idea of woman being made from a crooked rib is coming from these hadiths. Let me tell you another important thing, which is that the first discipline that developed in Islam was the discipline of hadith. The Arabs were nomads. They had no experience of governance or anything, but the Prophet Muhammad united them, and by the time of his death, they were already going outside of Arabia. And in 100 years, they had created an empire from Spain to India. They spread very, 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 very fast. As they were going from place to place, these Arabs of the desert who had no experience of how to govern, if something happened, if they came across a problem, they would ask themselves, what would the Prophet have done in this situation? And so they started collecting these various sayings which were attributed to the Prophet. But the sad thing is that the vast majority of these hadiths are not authentic. And this was the conclusion of the great hadith scholars. Bukhari examined more than 60,000 hadiths, and he authenticated less than 3,000. So it means the rest are not authentic. So that's why I'm mentioning it here is this. That's the first discipline to arise in Islam was the discipline of hadith. And this discipline of tafsir, which is the interpretation or exegesis of the Quran, came afterwards. So the hadith became the lens through which the Quranic text was read. So what you find in the hadith was read back into the Quranic text. This is a huge problem. And so therefore, you find these hadiths influencing the commentary, the exegesis of the Quran, although it's not in the Quran, okay? And in any case, in terms of how the rules of interpretation, if there is a clear statement in the Quran, it cannot be superseded by hadith. Even if you can find 100 ones, the Quranic text stands. But the problem is that the Quranic text, the interpretation itself has been so colored by these hadiths that remains a big problem. So anyway, so I did my research, and I could show all that, and I've written a lot about it. I don't know if you all have seen any of my writings, but if you haven't, I would like to send you a couple of my writings on this subject because it's very, very important. So anyway, in the meantime, my friends were out there, my activist friends, and they were getting a very bad treatment because the military rule was there, and they would come back to me from time to time and say, what are you doing? We asked you for help. Have you come up with anything? And are you still looking at Adam and Eve? And I said, actually, I am. And I said, let me explain to you why it is. Women, and this is not only Muslim women, but Christian women, actually Christian women more than any other, from any other religion, and Jewish women. The story starts with a creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 that I've talked to you about. And if a woman becomes inferior and subordinate in the story of creation itself, then that's never going to change. I had a Quranic teacher, and once he was talking to me about something, and he used this story, a metaphor. And he said, if you are in a train and you are going in some direction, sometimes the train gets derailed. It goes off the track and starts going in some other direction. And you realize after a while, this train is off track. What do you do then? You have to stop the train. You have to take it back to the point at which it became derailed, and then you put it on the right track. So this is what's happened with women. They were derailed at the point of creation. And unless we can take it all the way back and put it on the track, it'll never get back on track. And this is common to all these three religions for sure, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. In fact, it came into Islam from the Christian tradition. It was not in the Quranic text at all. But that is why, this study is so important. Because the Quran is so important for Muslims, how it's interpreted is of extreme importance, right? Every word means. So if you want to remove the patriarchal veneer that has been put, you have to go back and examine the text, each text. I say sometimes, this is a battle, you have to fight it verse by verse, word by word. There's no easy way to it. You can't just say, well, this is not acceptable to me. If you are a Muslim, you have to understand that. So that is what I was doing. Anyhow, I'll conclude my talk very soon. So I did that work and I communicated it to the people there. They thought that it would be an easy fix, that, okay, we make liberate women from patriarchy. There is no easy fix. If the Quran is being used to enslave women, you have to fight that interpretation. You have to come up with a different interpretation that is acceptable. So I call my work on the Quran, I say non-patriarchal interpretation of the Quran. I don't use the word feminist because the word feminist means so many different things. I say non-patriarchal because the patriarchal element, that's what's happened here. Anyway, so that was the first phase of my life was 1974 to 1984. In 1984, this new phase started. When I began to see the way forward, when I said, if Muslim women are going to have a theology of liberation, how it has to go, which way it has to go. So I started working on that. And I traveled very extensively during that time, traveled from Turkey to Indonesia and met all sorts of women. And as I said, my passion was that I want to educate Muslim women. And I'm happy to tell you that, there was only me, and now there are so many in so many different countries. And so I feel like the movement has started. It's still a very tough movement, very hard movement, because you have to go at it step by step, word by word, and make your case. So after that, since the last maybe, I retired from the University of Louisville after teaching for 33 years in 2009. And I started working on something else. When I look at Muslim women as a whole, what do I see? There are more than, if there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, half of them at least are Muslim women. And the majority of them, they have three characteristics. They are poor, they're illiterate, and they live in a village. This is their characteristic. And these women who are the most oppressed, who don't have access to anything, no education, nothing. My concern was, I'm here, I'm giving these talks and I'm writing these articles and going to these conferences. These women are never going to come here. How do I reach these women who are the largest group and the most affected group? What do I do? So I thought of this idea that, I need to train some people who can go to these villages. I can't, but they can. So I've been working on that, and I have trained people, social workers in Pakistan. I did a training course with a delegation from Afghanistan, which had some ulama and some women leaders and so on. Going through this whole, every subject, starting from creation and the fall story and divorce, marriage, everything. So I shared that with them. And so my idea is this, that it is, if you want to liberate Muslim women, you have to have a lot of these training groups in place. because they can go and talk to these people. But I tell you another thing. I want to leave you on a note of hope, that it is making a difference, because, for instance, if there's a girl who's bright, lives in a village, her father says, you're not going to go to school, you're not going to study, and she knows that the Quran gives her the right to education. She can say, but the Quran gives me the right to education. And if she has that ability to say that, she has a tool. It's interesting what happened in Iran. After the revolution, the Ayatollah, he said that all the universities had to expel the female students. They could not be coeducational. So there were all these women, and they had nowhere to study. So they went to the Ayatollah and they said, okay, you don't want us to study with men, all right, fine, but we have a right to education. According to the Quran, according to the Prophet. He said, yes. He said, then you give us our own universities. And the rate of women's literacy after the revolution in Iran went up 100%. People don't know that. But the Iranian women are very literate, and they got their own universities. There are no more women in the Iranian parliament than there are in virtually any Western country. So they fought for their rights and they got it. And there are other examples of this too, when they realize that, that they have rights. I've seen it happening in Indonesia, and, and it's interesting, people say, well, Muslim women are very subservient and so on. But, if you look at the list of world leaders around the world, 13 of them are Muslim women, 13, not 2 or 3, 13. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Turkey, Kosovo, North Cyprus, Singapore, so on and so forth, Africa, 13 of them. So I guess I should give you a chance to ask me some questions if I have not covered. I think you wanted me to talk about my personal life also, which I have done, and you have any more questions?
Yes, you have talked about, I asked you in the email, but during your lecture, I thought about some more.
Sure.
What was your
Mm-hmm.
what was your relationship with Islam before you got interested in the hermeneutics, the non-patriarchal hermeneutics?
That's a very, very good question. I had very, very strong belief in God as a child, because I told you I used to write poetry as a child, and I wrote a lot of, because I was so isolated in my own family, I started this conversation with God when I was just a child. And I had this vision that I am going through a very dark jungle that I used to, it seemed to me like that. And there's a little light in front of me that's guiding me out of this jungle. And it's, I just felt that God was guiding me out of this. So I had very, very strong belief in God. And, I came from a house that, it practiced Islamic rituals, like fasting and prayer and so on. But mainly in, my relationship was with God. And that still is true up till this point. I have never been able to identify with any Muslim society. There are 25 mosques in Louisville. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. We have 25 mosques. And in no mosque, not one of them, can I go and give this lecture that I have just given. They will never allow me to talk about women in Islam. I get invited all over the world, but I cannot go to the local mosque. And this is the tragedy of the situation. So my connection with the Islamic community is a strange one, My interest is that I would like to have the opportunity to educate young Muslims, especially young women. And I get that opportunity. Before COVID came, for a year, I was working with a group of young Muslim women going through the Quranic text, but I was teaching them in a Unitarian church. They gave me the space. I couldn't do it in a mosque. So, I still have that very strong faith in God, and that. But as I said, it's fortunate for me that I have never had a very strong need for community. Some people have. They must have a community, and I didn't have it, and I survived. If I'd had it, it would be much harder for me. I'm a teacher, and whenever I see anybody who has any interest in learning, I would love to teach and to communicate. And I have been trying the last few years to put my writings on my website. Unfortunately, a lot of my writings are scattered. There are so many books and articles and so on, and they're not in one place. So I've been working on the website. I hope that at least I can put my writings on the website. And now with mass media communication, I'm extremely bad at it. I'm not very technologically savvy, but I would like also to be able to record my thinking and my lectures, and maybe they will reach more people. But that's my story in a short way. So any other questions?
Yes, I would like you to explain why do you think the assumption that Eve was made from Adam's rib is so popular? I mean, you have explained that it is in the Hadith, but Quran is usually considered more important than Hadith, and most of Muslims, boys and girls, receive some religious education, if not in school, then in home. Are they not taught what is written in Quran, or they are just
Yeah. Well, they are, as I said, that people, Muslims generally, today's Muslims, are reading the Quran literally. They don't go behind it. It says God created Adam. They said Adam is a male person. They don't go into the origin of the word Adam, that Adam doesn't mean a male person. It's a Hebrew word. It means a human being. Because if you start from that point and says God created a human being, God sent that human being to the earth to be in charge of the earth, to work for justice and all that, then it puts men and women at an equal footing. They're both the representatives of God. But if you interpret that one word as, as male person, then, and so that's how the story goes. But what you're talking about, the greatest damage was done in this with regards to these stories, these two stories, the story of creation and the story of the fall, was done by the started with the Catholic priests and the Catholic theologians, and then was taken up by the Protestants. If you look at their writings, it runs like a refrain in their writings, for man. Okay, I'm going to repeat from my memory, not exactly like St. Paul. St. Paul is the most important formulator of the Christian tradition. He's really the founder of Christian theology in that sense. And he wrote a letter to the Corinthians, and the letter he said, I do not allow any woman to pray or prophesy with her head uncovered. The Jewish women had to cover their heads because, a woman was made from man, not man from woman. And man was made in the image of God, woman was made in the image of man. So, it's like, it's a hierarchy. It's like God, Christ, man, and woman. For 2,000 years, it's like that. And she's always at the bottom. If you go through the Christian theology from the earliest time, from St. Paul onwards until the 20, and now, even now, feminist theology in the Western world, in America, started less than 100 years ago. And in America, it became actually of public discourse since the 60s. 60s, the women's liberation movement. It was right there. So the text was interpreted. So if you go to a conservative Christian church, whether it's Catholic or it's Protestant, you will hear very similar things. That men are the one who decide. Women have to obey. Women must always obey. And if they don't obey, then they have to be punished. And otherwise, thinkers who were very great thinkers, like Saint Aquinas, greatest of the scholastic thinkers, very great in other ways, but extremely conservative, extremely, negative when it comes to women. That the only purpose for women's existence is that they bear children. But even in that fact of bearing children, the man has a greater role than the woman. I mean, it's unbelievable if you read what is in the scriptures. And so, when feminist theology developed in America in the 60s, then for the first time, women started interpreting these stories, and they started looking at these things. The sad thing as a Muslim is that all of this has so heavily impacted Muslims as well as Jews. Judaism came before Christianity, but also the Jewish people. That it's so they don't know the difference. They say the same things. I mean, they may differ on everything else, but on this position of women, women are, they were made to serve men. Women are inferior. Women, made from the rib, got Adam thrown out of paradise. So this is the challenge. And as I have analyzed the story of creation in great detail. I've talked about the story of the fall, because in the Bible it says, it's interesting. Let me tell you this point, that the story of the fall, which is in chapter 3 of Genesis, is interpreted that there was snake, the serpent, and he talked to the woman who was in the garden, and he said, "Did God tell you not to eat the fruit of this tree?" And she said, "Yes." God said, "We will die." And he said, "No, you will not die. You will become like God. You will have good knowledge of good and evil." And so the woman, this is the common interpretation. So the woman took the apple, she ate it, and then she took it to her husband, and she somehow managed to convince him to eat it. So he ate it, and then they were both naked. And then God said, "Why have you done this?" And then God punishes them and sends them out of paradise. Now, interpretation, that it's when the story starts, the serpent said to the woman, and it is assumed that the woman was by herself and Adam was not there. So he's having a conversation, serpent is having a conversation with a woman and saying, "Eat this fruit." And she eats it, and then she takes it to the husband. In the Hebrew text, the language is Hebrew, it says, the serpent spoke to the woman and talked to her about the forbidden fruit, and she takes it, and she said, then it says there's a word "ima" in Hebrew, which means with her. And he says, she took the apple and gave it to Adam, who was with her. So Adam was there all the time. But that one word was left out of translations until the 20th century. They just left it out. And there are so many incidents like that it's just deliberate misinterpretation, because if Adam was there, it changes the whole story. Then, he becomes responsible, and it's not like her. So, and this is the revolution that, and I tell you, I learned a lot from reading Christian theologians, because I saw what they were doing with the text. This is before I started doing my interpretation in detail. I saw what they were doing, how they were looking at the text. I mean, there are some theologians who are excellent, like Phyllis Tribble, who is a linguist, Hebrew linguist and so on, and Rosemary Ruther and Mary Daly. They did extremely good analysis of the language, and I learned from them. So, but I think, as far as, the theology is concerned of these religions, if women are religious and they want to believe that God has made them equal, then they have to know theology. Other than that, there's no other way. Because if they, if they go to a priest or a rabbi or a imam or somebody, they're going to get the traditional interpretation. Although, as I said, now, there are progressive people and so on. Unfortunately, very few in the Muslim world. But there's still, there's a mainstream thinking, mainstream theology. And that has not really changed that much. I was teaching at the university for 3 decades, and I taught a course on, women in the 3 traditions. And I had, I remember once a student, an American student, getting very furious with me. And she said, you are not a Christian, and you are telling us, you are reading the Bible, you are not taking it seriously. And I said to her, on the contrary, I'm taking it very seriously, because I'm treating it word by word. I'm telling you what these words mean. So I'm taking it seriously. But, she was angry with me because my interpretation did not agree with what she was hearing in the church. So it's very threatening to people. It's very threatening to women also. There are a lot of women. There are, if you really take a census of women, I think certainly in this country, in the United States, there are more conservative women than there are progressive. Progressive women are very few compared to the conservatives, and especially when it comes to religion. They believe whatever they hear in the church, and most of the churches are not progressive. So it's a common struggle, and I think if women, at least in these 3 religions, understand that and they unite and they see the common problem, it would be helpful to all of them. Instead of sort of saying this is, this came from here and it's their fault or not. This is male thinking. This is patriarchy that has infested all these things. And it's not only patriarchy also. Let me mention one other thing to you, because it seems to me you are very thoughtful and reflective. There is also the philosophical tradition, apart from the religious tradition, that came from Greece, Plato and Socrates and so on. Greek thought, they had this system that they called dualism. Dualism was the belief that reality consists of 2 principles, and one is higher than the other. There are 2, but one is higher than the other. And they identified the higher principle with male and the lower principle with female. When they said God is logos, God is, it's God, it's male, it's a male God. And so there's this idea that men are superior and women are inferior. This is philosophical. This came through Greece, and this has infected all these religions. So it's not only just the theology, not just the Quran, but it's also coming from the philosophical sources that they, because in Greek society was very heavily in favor of men against women, and so there we are. We got a lot of different